Tribal court clerks are absolutely the most important element in a tribal court system.
They are a vital part of the process.
That's the first person the public sees. The clerks are the backbone of the court, as most judges will understand.
They're the people that keep the court processes running, and they're the people that keep the judges in line.
They provide the perception for the entire justice system.
Judges are important, but the clerks are critical.
Tribal court.
American Indian and Alaska Native tribes throughout the country take responsibility for the health, safety, and well-being of tribal members by exercising sovereignty through their justice systems, the tribal courts. There is a great variation in the way tribal courts are structured and in the procedures that they follow. They may be modeled after the Western adversarial courts or be less formal and focused on healing and restorative justice. Tribal court rooms may look identical to state or federal courts, or there may be no specific courthouse and court takes place in whatever public building is available.
There is no typical tribal court. They run the whole gamut from tribal courts that do just child welfare and civil cases to tribal courts that handle everything from family law to probate to criminal to juvenile, complex litigation, employment appeals, grievances within the tribe, so they're all over the place.
If they don't take the case, we would notify you either.
There's a lot of variation between tribal court clerk duties from one tribe to another, and again, that's determined by the subject matters that that particular court hears, and also the size of that community and how many hours that court clerk works. Is she a part-time court clerk? Is she full-time? What their office hours are, if she has an assistant or not. If she's the only one there, she is wearing many hats, from court administrator to budget person to the person who goes into court and hears the hearings and records them. Or she may, if it's a larger court, be specialized. She may only do court recordings, or she may only do filings, or she may have just several of those many hats.
The qualifications for tribal court clerks vary from tribe to tribe.
I understand the tribal clerk position is open, and I would like to submit my application for the position.
Yes, it has been open for a while, and we are accepting applications for it.
Do you require a resume?
A resume is not required, but we...
As far as the requirements for that tribal court clerk, they vary from tribe to tribe. Generally, most tribes require at least a high school education. They obviously need to be able to read and write and have some grammar skills for sure. There's usually a background check if necessary. It doesn't have to be a formal background check, but you want to make sure that they're an upstanding citizen because they do represent the community and people have to put a lot of faith in that person. And they should have some basic office skills, especially with Microsoft Office products at a minimum. Microsoft Office can do a lot for tribal court clerk, so that skill she should have, or she should be willing to be trained in that. But you don't need a law degree, you don't need a bachelor's degree. They certainly are helpful, especially when looking at tribal laws and ordinances to determine what your duty should be and what forms and things need to be developed, but someone with a high school diploma at least.
Your job is important because the first person they see, that the public sees when they come in, is they see you clerks. May I help you?
Good public relations skills are important qualifications for court clerks. Those who use the court usually encounter the tribal court clerks first. It is important for clerks to be friendly to the public. It is critical that the clerk have excellent organizational skills. Clerks are required to keep track of volumes of paperwork and schedules of court activity. Clerks should be professional and helpful to people using the court, to court judges, all courtroom personnel, and to all agencies that interface with the court.
You're a public trustee. The public comes into your court and you represent the court, and when you represent the court, you represent your community and your tribal government. So you have to keep that in mind as well.
Basically, you're a role model.
The court clerk shares the responsibility for maintaining the integrity of the court and also for the acceptance of that court in the Indian community.
The clerks, like the judges, hold positions of trust in the tribal community and must comply with the standards of conduct expected of that position. Clerks are charged with assisting the judges in conducting the court's functions effectively.
Court clerks need to constantly be aware of the respect and loyalty to the judges of the court.
Criticism of the judge's decisions or work habits to others are inappropriate. Such expressions serve only to injure public confidence. Maintaining the integrity of the court also includes the obligation to be accurate and thorough in assignments given by the judges. Jurisdiction is the authority and responsibility to enforce law. Tribal jurisdiction is complex, and how it is exercised varies throughout the country from tribe to tribe. It is essential that the court clerk is familiar with the existence and scope of jurisdiction of the court where they are employed. This includes being familiar with traditional values and customs of the tribe, the tribal constitution and judicial codes, and any specific court rules the tribal court has adopted. It is also important to be familiar with certain federal laws the tribal court is operating under, such as the Indian Civil Rights Act.
The Indian Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress in 1968 because the listing of rights we have under the federal constitution protects our rights with respect to the federal government, but not with respect to tribal governments. So Congress passed this law, which applies to all tribal governments throughout the United States, and says that certain rights have to be protected by those tribal governments in any proceeding before a tribal court. And of that listing of rights, one of the most fundamental is the right to due process of law. If a tribal court is going to make a decision about me or my liberty or my property, I have the right to notice and an opportunity to be heard before a fair and impartial tribunal. And for the court clerks, the most important of those three elements would be the notice, because usually the tribal courts rely on the clerk to make sure that the notice gets issued and that everybody understands when and where the hearing is going to be or how they have to respond. So it's really important for the court clerk to understand what the rules are and to make sure that the notice is clear enough to have everybody understand, here's what you want to do in order to make sure that your voice is going to be heard by the tribal court. There are three other aspects of due process that are also important and where the court clerk's role is fundamental. One is that the court has to keep good records. If somebody complains that the tribal court violated their due process rights, the more complete and accurate the records are, the more the tribal court will be able to defend its actions against any kind of an attack like that, and that's the court clerk's responsibility. Following your own rules is an important aspect of what tribal courts have to do, and so it's important that court clerks understand what the rules are and make sure that any steps that they take are in conformity with the court's rules. And the third thing is maintaining confidentiality. Some of the cases that come in front of tribal courts are cases involving children, guardianships of elder persons, where there are private personal issues, and the court has rules that says this information has to be kept confidential. It's vitally important that the court clerk understand and respect that confidentiality and not talk about those cases outside the court at all.
One key role in providing fairness in the court is for clerks to be highly ethical and to avoid letting their personal views or relationships affect the activities of the court. They must maintain the confidentiality of tribal court cases.
Anita Marks will perform the clerk's duty faithfully and honestly. I will not let personal views and relationships affect the performance of my clerk's duties.
Like the judge, the court clerk is required to be impartial. Physical cues or body language within the view of parties or jurors reduce that impartiality. The clerk should avoid expressions that would indicate a reaction to testimony and dialogue in the courtroom.
You know, tribal court clerks are the first contact that most people will have with the justice system. Being the first contact point, they are going to be asked a lot of questions. They're going to be asked for a lot of information, and I think it's important for clerks to know what information they can give and what information they cannot give.
Frank, what can I do to help you today?
I need some help filing a petition with tribal courts, and I need some help doing that. I don't know what to do.
What we would need you to do is take the appropriate forms and complete them as best you can, as much detail as you can. And
what I think the clerks can do as far as giving responses to the questions from the users of the court, they can explain, in fact, I think they have an obligation to explain the court processes. How can I bring my dispute to court to get a resolution? What forms can I fill out? What forms can I use? I think there is a public service element to the clerk's role here to give legal process information about the procedures and assist them in filling out forms if they need some help and that sort of thing. I think that's an obligation and a must-do for tribal court clerks. Tribal court clerks generally can answer questions that contain the word how. As an example, how can I file a petition? Or how can I get a protective order? Those questions, I think the clerk can provide the information because it's referring to information about the legal process. And it's assisting the party to bring get their case into court to have a judge make a decision. In terms of tribal court clerk don'ts, tribal court clerks don't give legal advice. Legal advice, even though there's no clear definition, is basically telling someone what course of legal action they should take. So if the question to the clerk includes the word should I or whether, the tribal clerk should be alert that this question, the answer to this question, could be providing legal advice and giving that person specific directions of a legal action to take, and that is not proper. An example of giving legal advice: should I get a protective order? The response to that could be considered legal advice if you tell them yes or no. Should I appeal this case? And then the response again, if it's yes or no, is telling that party to take a particular course of action. That is not the role of the tribal court clerk, and it can be considered giving legal advice.
Forms are important for a fair and consistent court system. They ensure that necessary information is gathered and documented in a dependable way. Forms are tools for communication between the court, parties, agencies, and other court systems.
Tribal court clerks are often the person who develops the forms for that tribal court. And those forms are used for everything from filing a complaint to sending out a notice of hearing. It could be a protection from harassment order that a judge would use and just check off standard order items. For instance, no one would come within 500 feet of the victim, etc. So the court clerk is responsible for developing forms, and that's really hard, but they should be standardized. She should use the same format generally. For each form, there should be a standardized header. Information should be in the same font if possible. The other thing is she should take a copy of every form she develops and place them in a binder with an index of what those forms are, and each form should also, at the very bottom in very small font, should say when it was last revised. Keep the most current copy, get rid of the old ones, because you don't want 3 or 4 forms out there. You want just one of each item. The other thing too is that a court clerk, and here's where those relationships with your state municipal courts come in handy, borrow their forms and look at them and get a general idea of how they set those forms up, but you don't have to use their language, but you want an idea of what they encompass. And then you can modify it on your WordPerfect or your MS Word to work for your court. If you know how to use MS Word, the tables, that's a wonderful ability, and you don't have to buy fancy software to do that, but you should try to keep them standardized, maintain a book of all your forms so that you can photocopy them as necessary and hand them out. Keep the revision date on them.
Filing is an essential function of the tribal court clerk. The term filing has several meanings. One meaning is when someone presents a document, such as a petition, to the court. The clerk stamps or marks the document to indicate the date and time the document has been filed with the clerk's office. The party filing the document keeps a copy that is marked to show when the document was filed with the court. The judge, not the clerk, determines whether or not a document was received in a timely manner. Another meaning for filing is when a document is placed or filed in a case file folder. The folder is then placed or filed in the correct place in the office filing system. It is important to double-check that documents are filed consistently.
Some have a file folder that has 3 or 4 flaps, and in the first flap you will find, basically it's called a docket sheet, and it's sort of the table of contents to what's in that file. And it's organized by date, and some people will assign a docket number to each docket item. So like 101 could be the initial complaint. And then there could be the response, and there could be the list of attorneys or representatives, and then other filings as they come. There could be exhibits in that file. Sometimes there's correspondence from the court clerk's office to the parties or the people involved, so there might be notices of hearing. And there's a wide variation in how that's organized, and a lot of times it's driven by how the judge uses that folder.
When I'm filing, I use metal fasteners to keep my
It
files.
is best to use file folders that have metal fasteners so that documents can be attached to the file securely and in proper order with the most current information on top. Files should be reviewed regularly to ensure against misfiling and to weed out extra copies of documents. When a record is being researched, the entire file should be taken out of the filing cabinet and not just a single document. This ensures that the case file remains intact. When a case file is in use, there should be a marker put in its place that notes the name of the person who took the file and the date it was taken. Computer files need to be managed so that only a select number of people have access. Electronic files should have passwords known only to those permitted access to documents for additions or corrections. If there is a public computer program for accessing court files, it usually contains a read-only version of the docket sheet and not the documents themselves.
Record retention for tribal courts is one of the most important things out there, and I would urge any court, especially if they're just starting, this is the best time to do it, is to develop a record retention policy and procedure right from the get-go, and you will not have trouble down the road. But if you're an existing court, you need to get out there and develop one. And what a record retention policy is a way of deciding how you're going to maintain your records and how you're going to store them when they're no longer in use. And that means you need to know which records you need to hang on to for future use. And you also need to think about where you're going to store them and how you're going to store them. Because if you think you're going to just put all your old court records in a box and put them in a supply closet somewhere, that's not going to work, because you need to think about things like, is it going to leak? When the snow melts, are you going to have roof leakage? Are your files going to get damaged? If you have the money, ideally you might want to have those scanned as computer images, or you may want to invest in a microfiching system. Or if you don't have those resources, and most tribal courts do not, then you are going to be storing paper in boxes, but you need to think about, are they up off the floor? Are they secured? Is there a system in place for locating each box and knowing what's in that box? And even before you start any of that, you need to decide which records merit keeping. How do you know? Are you going to keep all your child welfare cases? Are you going to keep juvenile cases, criminal cases? Civil cases sometimes are not as important, so who decides that? You and the judge, maybe your tribal council decides what you keep, how long, and then you need to devise the storage system, how they're going to be stored, and then how they're going to be located and accessed, And then there's a certain lifespan for those where eventually they will have to be destroyed, and how are you going to destroy them? Is someone going to burn them in a burn pit or barrel? Are they going to be shredded? You need to really think about that before you start building these records, but if they're already in place, you need to address that issue.
The calendar is very important for a clerk because in tribal court we have ICWA cases and we have tribal court cases, and we have to calendar
Maintaining the court's calendar, or court docket as it may be called, is critical to keeping the cases moving through the court system. It is essential that some system is used to organize and remind the clerk of documents to be prepared and processed on a daily basis. A tickler system is used to remind the clerk to prepare and send notices and other documents. Both calendaring and a tickler system are best accomplished through computer software that can range from sophisticated court software to the use of a basic office computer program that comes with most computers. Once the court has accepted a case, a hearing should be scheduled according to the time frames under tribal law and the availability of judges to hear the case. When a case is calendared, the clerk also marks the date that the notice or a summons or subpoena needs to be sent under tribal law or court rules. The case should always remain on a calendar until it is closed. Notice is an essential and required part of providing due process. Following tribal law and/or policies regarding the process of notifying parties of proceedings is critical to a fair process. The clerk is responsible for preparing and giving notice to the parties. These forms indicate the case number, purpose of the proceeding, names of the parties, and the date, time, and place of the proceeding. Tribal law or policy should indicate the methods of delivery, which could include mailing by certified mail with a return receipt or hand delivery by someone designated by the court. When a notice is given to a party, there should be a copy placed in the case file and the method of delivery recorded. This can be done as a notification in the case notes or through a signed form such as a statement of mailing or statement of personal service. The clerk's role generally includes preparing the courtroom for proceedings, duties during court, and duties after the court session. These duties vary from one court system to another. The clerk needs to make sure that the files are complete and presented to the judges for their review prior to the hearing. Preparing the courtroom before proceedings may include having water or coffee available, setting up tape recording and teleconferencing equipment, preparing case files, and having pens and paper available for court personnel.
Nita, may I have that file on case number 071023?
Judges generally review the cases prior to the proceedings, and preparation should be completed for their review. Once a hearing begins, the clerk is responsible for recording the proceedings using an audio recording, word processor, or by hand. Clerk duties may include administering oaths to parties, witnesses, and jurors, connecting people by teleconference, and maintaining custody of exhibits. Some courts include the clerk in the process of jury selection and duties relating to the jury process. The court clerk is generally responsible for the recording of court proceedings.
All proceedings and hearings are recorded in some manner. Usually they're recorded, for most tribal courts, on tape. And it could be a simple tape recorder, or it could be a fancy linear advocate system. Some tribal courts, especially smaller courts, have someone physically taking notes. And while that will work, the recording machine is the most important way to go. And it really can be a simple tape recorder, but you need to have a counter on it. Something that starts at 000, so that you as a court clerk can note at what number the counter was at when an order was issued, when a piece of evidence was offered, or an objection was made, because that counter and the little notations that you make, that's your roadmap to what's on that tape, because there are occasions where a recorded hearing will have to be transcribed, and you don't know if you're going to be there when that's done. And so the person that's going to transcribe it needs a map to what's on that tape. And here's another important thing: when you're doing a recording of a hearing, you need to have all parties identify themselves by name at some point. So tribal court judges or elders who are doing those hearings need to have people identify themselves at the beginning, so whoever's transcribing that court later can recognize the voices later when transcribing. It is simply not good enough to turn the recording machine on and leave the room. Someone should be taking notes so that they can accompany those recordings. Recordings of hearings need to be stored, and the best place to store it ideally is in a fireproof cabinet, especially those matters that are sensitive, like child welfare cases, juvenile and criminal. They should be stored in a cabinet, and there should be an index of each tape, and they should be numbered and listed on that index so that you can access them later.
An adequate record of court proceedings encourages recognition and comity or respect by other court systems and is helpful in discovering any inconsistencies of the court if the case is appealed. Less formal and more traditional systems such as circle sentencing or peacemaking systems often do not record proceedings. These styles are used for healing. The healing process is very delicate, and often hearings using these styles do not lend themselves well to recording. Tribal court clerks may or may not be required to draft orders of the court for the judges. If this is part of the clerk's job for a particular tribal court, it is extremely important to be trained specifically in this task. Orders drafted at the request of the judge are given to them for review and corrections, and then signed by one or more judges. Clerks are generally responsible for sending signed orders to all parties. Court orders may require a person to pay fees, fines, or restitution.
There has to be a policy in place, usually dictated by your finance department, about how to document the fees and fines and restitutions that come in and where they go. Your court may be sending restitution directly to the victims as the court has ordered. Fines and fees may go into the general fund, or there may be a special court account that the finance department maintains. But normally you're going to post all of those transactions into some form, either a ledger or just a write-up that you give to finance department with the checks and the fees that come in. But there needs to be a system, and it's not too involved generally for tribal court. It's normally passed off to the finance department, but you are collecting those. And then you should also maintain balances so you know what's in there as well, even though they're going to finance, so that if tribal council asks you how many fees or fines you collected, you can report that back as well.
When a case is appealed, the appellate court is reviewing the record of what happened at the trial court level. It is absolutely important that there be a good and accurate record which is assembled by the court clerk. There will be no new trial. It's highly unusual for there to be a new trial. So the appellate court is going to rely on the trial court's ability to provide them with a good record so that they can make a decision upon whether the correct law was applied or whether there was a basic unfairness to one of the tribal members. And that is why it is so crucial that the court clerk provide that.
An appeal usually begins with a written notice of appeal filed with the clerk or with a clerk of the appellate court, along with any pertinent documents and fees that may apply. Building and maintaining good relationships with other courts and agencies is an essential role of the tribal court clerk.
At the Resource Center, we get a lot of calls from court clerks asking for assistance with certain forms or procedures. And while we are there, a tribal court clerk needs to learn to reach out to other courts in her area. Any tribal court clerk who doesn't reach out to the local, state, municipal, or federal courts even in her area is missing out on a lot of free resources. And honestly, the peer networking is invaluable, and just to have someone who says, this is how we do it. You do not have to make your tribal court look like the state or federal or municipal court, but there may be some procedures that you can adapt that work better for your community. And so I would urge any clerk to reach out and use them. No one is going to turn you away. Probably the best resource out there for a tribal court clerk are those state, municipal, and federal courts in her region or her state. And she really should reach out and establish relationships. It's a simple phone call, a meeting with a clerk for coffee. It's that easy.
The court clerk has a very important role in developing good relationships with other courts and other agencies. We as Indian people have a tripartite citizenship. We're federal citizens, we're state citizens, and we're tribal citizens. And we live today in a world that interacts with all of these three entities. And we do not live in a vacuum. We do not live in our own little portion of the universe. It's absolutely necessary for us to interact well, to receive the respect and the integrity, and to help our own people receive the respect and integrity in the larger society, particularly in the institution of the courts. The court system is well respected and an integral part of the American society, and that is why it's so important for us to develop in this area.
The most difficult part of being a clerk is separating your daily work from your home. Being a clerk is very stressful, and you take home a lot of those cases with you. You can't help but feel for those people. You can't help but hurt for those children.
My word of advice is to do what you enjoy and to continue to grow in every aspect and have fun.
Just being out there, being able to communicate with all the different departments and all of us all being on the same page to focus on where we want to be and getting there. I think that's what I really enjoy.
My job is helping the elderly, letting them know that we got through to them and they were understood and they feel comfortable when they leave our office.
Just be happy and take care of yourself and take care of your family and take care of everybody that you love, because everybody in your tribe is your family, and it's important to look at them that way.